Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's History of Fresh Produce live stream. Patrick, we're back in front of our computers after a nice little rendezvous in New York City, right?
I enjoyed that.
Yeah,
That was fun.
it was. It was. Not every day you're up here in my neck of the woods. So
No. Listen, John's always like, "Hey, where you're from?" And I'm like, "I'm not from Florida." I finally got to go where John is, where John lives. So it was great. And everyone. I came back with something though. I think being around millions of people, and I came back with a
little gift.
little gift of cold, the gift that doesn't stop giving. So bear with me on my voice too, because I'm legitimately getting over something here.
Yeah. Well, that's the beauty of live. Look, that's how committed we are to our listeners, Patrick. We do not give you or anybody who's sick a day off when when we have a live stream. But to do what we usually do is give a little rundown of where we've been and where we're going. So listeners, since our last time, would have heard our episodes on the fascist origins of organics,
Which was cool, by the way. I learned a lot on that one, John. I want to be real with you. It was really interesting. And if you do not know about organics, or you're that person like that says no, organics doesn't mean anything, check out this episode, because even me, I even said in the episode, like, I've been saying things wrong this whole time as well after learning. So it was pretty cool. So I loved that.
a very different perspective on organics. Then, of course, the Sullivan expedition, which is another, again, unique story in the Revolutionary War that a lot of people haven't heard about. And it's really a war all about produce. So that was an interesting one. And then, of course, more recently, parts 1 and 2 of the Llewellyn series, which is our biggest series yet, right? So 6 parts. And for our HFP Club members, you would have been able to hear all 3 parts by this point, the first 3 parts. And then the next 3 parts after that are going to drop when the 4th episode drops. And so the next few weeks, for those not part of the club, you'll get parts 3, 4, 5, 6 of that series. It's a hell of a story. So definitely stay tuned for all that. I mean, I think listeners will have heard the Oregon Trail episode this week that dropped yesterday. And that, of course, was a lot of fun for you and me, Patrick, reminiscing on the old days of Oregon Trail games, computer games and stuff.
Right.
Bringing that. I actually played that with my son this week, and I was inspired. I said, you know what, let's sit down and play Oregon Trail. I felt bad. 2 of my sons died on the trip, but one survived. So that was a total loss. And then after the Llewellyn series is done, we have a special episode on the history of soils, where we're going to have a special guest. Patrick, you weren't on that one, but I did have a special guest join me on that. So something else to look forward to. And that's where we've been. So a lot of episodes come out and a lot to look forward to.
I like it.
Yeah.
I do have a question, out there. If anybody is watching, I love it. So Amy wrote already, which is great. Was learning a lot about the Llewellyn series so far. Amy, shout out. She has her podcast up in New England, everyone, sustainability, that I was just on. So shout out to Amy. But one thing I'm going to tell everybody. So right now, please let us know if your feeds are going through. I just got an update on YouTube and LinkedIn that it's just loading. So if it's just loading for you, I'm sorry. It shows it's live on our screen. But yeah, on some of these, John, it's not loading at all. Yeah. So if you are watching, awesome, keep commenting. And if not, if it's loading on your screen, we'll have the full video for you up on the app later today. Okay.
Absolutely.
Not sure why it's doing that.
Well, that's out of our scope.
Yeah. It's out of our scope of business, everyone.
Yeah, that's not
We're
us.
just the hosts.
So here we are, live stream. So Patrick, why don't you tell our listeners where we're heading today?
Well, do we have to? No, I
think so.
Of course, yeah. So John, let's get into it, because today we're really diving into the world of the American farmland, and more specifically into the modern controversy that's grown up around who owns it, who works it, and what it says about the American identity. So I think it's a very important topic. And I've got a couple off topic segues that relate into this as we go through this. But where is the American identity, John?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hot topic, right? I mean, just in the last couple of weeks, which is honestly what spurred this live stream subject today,
Right.
we heard from the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, Miss Brooke Rollins, on July 8th, and she unveiled this USDA National Farm Security Action Plan, addressing what she called, quote, urgent threats from foreign adversaries and committing to, quote, strengthening the resilience of America's food and agricultural systems. Now, if you listen to that speech, which again, I happened to be because I saw this was a press conference about agriculture, so it kind of piqued my interest. There's quite strong and direct rhetoric here, Patrick. And honestly, kind of a mainstay of this administration, right? That's kind of their tone. And she said, quote, we feed the world, we lead the world, and we'll never let foreign adversaries control our land, our labs, or our livelihoods. And then she went on further to declare that under President Trump's leadership, American agriculture will be, quote, strong, secure, resilient. All sounds good so far, right? No one is going to argue too much about
Sounds
those
good.
points, right? And then it went a step further. So she had a bunch of other people there from the administration speaking on the topic. You also had a Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, who added another layer of more, I would say, gravity to the situation. And she said, quote, food policy is national security policy. A country who cannot feed itself cannot take care of itself. We will never let any other country control our food supply or control our people. So basically, this new plan aims to prevent farmlands from being owned by foreign adversaries and bolster food system defenses. Again, on the surface, that all sounds reasonable. Now, during that same press conference, it was also shared that the administration is aiming to achieve a 100% American workforce on farms. And to that point, Secretary Rollins stated that no amnesty would be offered for undocumented laborers. So instead, the administration would promote a workforce made up of what they called able bodied Americans. Who that is very unclear. They suggested that it could be those on Medicaid that could be mobilized, which is an interesting strategy and thought. But in addition to that, an increase in investment in automation. And Patrick, obviously, we've heard a lot about that within the industry, of course, robotics and automation, AI, all these things.
Correct, man. Correct. And one thing, that we got to look at is there are security concerns fueling all of this, right? Isn't there, John?
Yeah, there is. Yeah.
So in June, the U.S. Department of Justice charged foreign nationals, including a Chinese Communist Party member, with smuggling, right, noxious fungus into the United States, a potential agro-terrorism weapon linked to billions in global crop losses. That said, it's unlikely that agro-terrorism was the objective here, as the two Chinese nationals were university researchers looking to bring samples to another university lab in the U.S. to study the fungus further. But this incident highlighted a disturbing trend, okay? Alleged infiltration of American agriculture by adversarial powers, from land purchases to cyber attacks. So the narrative goes, America's enemies are playing the long game, and American sovereignty is under siege via the very soil that feeds the people.
Mm.
But as well as we'll see, such fears are not new, John, right?
No, not at all.
They're not.
No. They're really part of this recurring historical pattern, one where anxiety about lands and labor gets wrapped up into this broader
Yeah.
concern about sovereignty, about security and national character, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I'm reading some of the comments. We're having some comments on LinkedIn already, which is really great. So let's start pulling out at the roots, John. Who's actually been buying up American farmland throughout the centuries, and who's been working it? And I've got a couple of real life examples too here in Florida on some growers that I know that I'm going to talk about as well. So let's get started.
Yeah, so we're gonna kind of paint this picture, right? Because there's a few things to touch on here. So, like you said, let's talk on land ownership first, right? And I should mention that we're going to keep this pretty high level, as many of the examples could honestly be their own episode, which Patrick will probably do at some point anyway. So, if anything, this will whet your appetite and get, kind of again, a high level understanding of where this all fits into the current rhetoric. So, contrary to popular belief, foreign investment in American farmland and land in general is hardly a new thing. And so, to that point, let's go back to the early 19th century, probably one of the earliest examples, because throughout the 19th century, many Americans believed that foreign, particularly British, investment posed a grave threat to Republican virtue. And this fear echoed sentiments from the Revolutionary era, right? Where colonists accused Britain of corrupting the colonies. And we heard this, of course, in our Boston Tea Party series. And so it's actually quite striking just how similar that language is to what we're hearing today about Chinese investment. Because again, back then, British capital was seen as ideologically toxic, yet paradoxically deeply necessary. Because after independence, the debate wasn't over whether America needed an investment. It did, but about what kind and from whom. And so Hamilton, yes, that man for which the Broadway show is named after, and his fellow Federalists envisioned an America that was elite led and had a stable economy, basically a continuation of the existing socioeconomic hierarchy found in Britain. That's kind of format he wanted. On the opposite side, you had the Jeffersonian Republicans, who by contrast wanted an egalitarian economy that expanded access to land and capital to all. Well, maybe not to all, maybe at least for free white men, right? Now, ironically, the Jeffersonians' victory in 1800, which aimed to limit federal power and taxes, undermined the state's ability to fund national infrastructure. So they turned to the private market. And who had capital to spare? The British. And of course, there was the Dutch too, and some other European powers, but we're going to focus here on the British because they were the biggest foreign investor in the United States at this time. Now, how did that work? So, British money basically financed everything from Western land purchases to transportation infrastructure, and it even partially underwrote the Louisiana Purchase. And it's important to reiterate Republican ideology despised foreign capital, right? They saw it as this corrupting thing. But their policy made it a necessity. It was the lesser essentially of the two evils, the other option being higher taxes, which they're really against. Now, British capital was especially important in the American South. The cotton economy was deeply dependent on British credit. And so the supply chain often led straight back to London. Yet this didn't sit comfortably with many Democrats who believed private capital, again, especially when foreign and concentrated, posed a corrupting influence. And Andrew Jackson exemplified this tension, right? He railed against the Second Bank of the United States for being partially foreign owned while watching states become more reliant on that British credit. And it was, I believe it was historian Jay Sexton that said basically it was a dilemma of their own making. They rejected taxation and federal aid, so they turned to foreign investors. And what ended up happening is some severe consequences. So the Panic of 1837 hits, and at that time, there were a number of states that obviously were on a lot of British credit. And when that panic hit, 8 states and 1 territory, that territory being Florida wasn't a state yet, defaulted on their debts. And so British investment fled the US for a decade. Obviously not a great thing when a lot of your financing depends on foreign investment, specifically from Britain. That said, by the late 1840s, the British capital started entering the US again, but this time there was a slight shift. So they were still uh, basically investing in state government debt, but now they're also going into more uh, uh, private projects like private railroads. And so by 1853, nearly 1/3 of surveyed railroads had received foreign investment. And on the eve of the Civil War, a staggering 90% of foreign investment in the US came from Britain, which is mind boggling. Now, after the Civil War, US industrialization and the first era of globalization completely reshaped the economy. So the North, in particular, benefited from Republican policies that promoted tariffs, internal improvements, national markets, whereas the South and West remained resource suppliers, right? Increasingly dependent on the markets of the North. So, in effect, these policies helped to redistribute wealth from the rural democratic South and West to the largely Republic Midwest and Northeast of the country. And yet, the US, for all its industrial growth, at this point remained a second tier economic power because it relied heavily, heavily, heavily on British capital and global infrastructure. Everything from communication cables, insurance for traded goods, cargo shipping to move the goods. This was all coming from British financing and British resources. So the Jeffersonian fear of a powerful federal government started to fade because now the real fear became this foreign controlled capital, right? And that shift is incredibly key to understanding late 19th century populism. And so if we go a little further down that timeline, British investors now become especially active in the American West during the 1880s. They bought up land for cattle ranching and invested heavily in mortgage companies that lent to small farmers. And the reason why they did that because lenders could earn 9 to 12%, which is not a bad return if you're throwing money around. But when the agricultural depression hit the states in the late 1880s, many of those farmers defaulted and as a return lost their lands. And as you can imagine, just complete outrage followed. And one of the responses to this event was the Alien Land Law of 1887, which banned foreign ownership of lands in the U.S. territories, not the states, just the territories. And it was aimed squarely at the British. But like a number of bills and laws that we see even to in this modern day, it ultimately lacked teeth. And so 10 years later, there still hadn't been a single forfeiture as a result of this bill. Now, the irony is rich here, right? Because American Republicans who once feared the taxes more than capital found themselves trapped by the very foreign investment they had come to rely on. They wanted the roads, they wanted the railroads, they wanted expansion, but they didn't want to fund it themselves. And that ambivalence about needing capital, but resenting the terms that came with it has been a constant in American history. And it echoes pretty loudly in today's debates over Chinese investment and food security and national sovereignty. But Patrick, before we jump too far ahead, I believe you have another example from history for us on the foreign land ownership topic. So we're going to leave the British to the side now. So who are we looking at next in this scene?
Well, let's fast forward to the 20th century then, okay? Because here we see a different kind of concern, the so-called yellow peril. I would say this time, the focus wasn't on British investors, but on Japanese immigrants, especially in California. So my home state in the 18, John, you heard that? My home.
I heard you.
Okay.
Yeah, no.
I just want to be very clear because John always says where you're from. And I'm like, John, I just live here in Tampa. Like, he's like, yeah. No.
I'll always be my home safe for you.
Anyway. And I'm always like, people are like, you should not tell people you're from California. 100% not. I'm born and raised in California. I love California. But I love Florida right now better, just because I love the beach. But let's go back. In the 1880s, many Japanese immigrants first arrived into Hawaii. Then they made their way to the West Coast over the following decades, right? They worked tirelessly to build lives as farmers. They had to work with lower wages than their, white counterparts and pay significantly higher rent prices. But despite all this, they were able to push on and turn what was generally considered undesirable land into fertile, productive land, John.
Yeah.
So that success, they earned both admiration and intense resentment. So many white Californians saw them not just as outsiders, but in economic threats, right? So this tension culminated in laws like the 1913 Alien Land Act, right? That we show, and which barred aliens ineligible for citizenship, a category that included all Asian immigrants from owning or leasing land at all, John. Yeah. So these lands forced, to move every few weeks, tearing them from the land they had cultivated with such effort and even passion, right?
Yeah, and actually, you know what? We'll return to the Japanese experience when we dive into foreign labor because there's kind of two things going on here between land ownership and the labor side. But
Mhm.
even here, in the question of land ownership, Patrick, that you're kind of spelling out here, you see the same fears resurfacing. What we just described with the British, right? But now it's only layered with racism as well as economic anxiety. So just an interesting evolution here.
How dare them?
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, you are right, and even then, like we've got some questions that have already pulled up, but I really want to get through the subject matter first, and then I want to pull up some questions and some case
Sure.
studies. So the story doesn't end there, John. So let's jump ahead again to so obviously back to 1888, now 20th century, now back to late 1980s. Japan's economy is roaring. The yen is strong. Japanese corporations are flush with capital. Meanwhile, in the US, though, things look bleak, especially in rural America. The Midwest has just endured I would say, a brutal farm crisis. Farmland values have collapsed. Rural banks have failed, and entire communities are reeling. So, into this vacuum stepped a new kind of investor. Japanese corporations, entrepreneurs, and conglomerates looking to invest abroad. At the start of the 1980s, Japanese entities owned just 25,000 acres of U.S. farmland valued at about 54 million. Wow. But by 1990, the number had surged to over 539,000 acres, worth more than $1 billion, a 20-fold increase in a single decade, John.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just farmland. Japanese firms were buying into the entire agricultural supply chain, from orchards and ranches to slaughterhouses, bakeries, grains, the silos, bottling plants, and even convenience stores. So it wasn't random either. Some of it was speculative, riding the wave of Japan's booming economy, but much of it was strategic.
Mhm.
So trade agreements like 1988 US Japan beef and citrus understanding opened up Japanese markets to American beef and citrus. That gave, though, the Japanese companies a strong incentive to vertically integrate, controlling not just retail sales, but production, processing, distribution, right? So there's a lot into it. So in the 80s, we see a wave of acquisitions. Citrus growers in California and Florida, along with nearby juice plants and packing houses, vineyards in Napa and Sonoma, apple orchards in Oregon and Washington, and even rice in Northern California. The investment was geographically focused, right? Western states like California, Washington, Oregon, and Hawaii attracted the most interest, right? Now, why? Partially, it's due to proximity to Japan,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
All they got to do is jump over the Pacific Rim.
Yeah, that's it.
But also because of the quality of their agricultural output, though, too, right? These were premium zones producing top tier citrus, wine, grapes, and beef. Speaking of beef, pasture land became one of the largest categories for acquisition, from Kansas cattle ranches to the plains of Montana. Japanese investors were buying up grazing land to supply Japan's growing appetite for high quality beef. Forest land was another target, often secured through joint ventures with American partners. Now, you might expect there would have been a backlash, right?
Yeah.
After all, this was the same period when fears of Japanese dominance were reaching fever pitch in the US. So the image of Japan buying Rockefeller Center in New York City or Sony purchasing Columbia Pictures, it fed a narrative of, once again, economic invasion, John. Okay.
Mhm.
But as I take a sip, in agriculture, the concern wasn't just about foreign ownership, it was about concentration. Could these firms dominate markets? Could they act kind of like monopolistically? That's where the kairetsu come in. Powerful Japanese corporate networks like Mitsubishi, Marubeni, Mitsui, and Sumitomo. These weren't just landowners, John. They were vertically integrated powerhouses active across the food industry. So, like Mitsubishi alone, we've all heard of that name, right?
Yeah.
Mitsubishi alone had interest in at least 15 American agribusiness ventures, everything from vineyards to vegetable oil processors. These companies had the scale and coordination to influence entire segments of the market. Yet, it wasn't all doom and gloom. Japanese investment brought in capital, technology, and export opportunities. Their appetite for premium American produce helped drive up prices for citrus growers and cattle ranchers. So while there were fears of exploitation, the reality was more, I would say, not so. There were mutual benefits, right? But then came the crash. Japan's economic bubble burst in the early 90s, right? Land values plummeted. Return to the U.S. Real estate and agriculture turned out to be far lower than expected. And with that, Japan's buying spree ended as abruptly as it began, though, too, John.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So I think that's another good example of just kind of the evolution of, again, there's obviously other foreign powers investing in the U.S. over that period, but I think it's a good case study. But let's step now into the 21st century, and the landscape of again of American farmland quite literally has changed, right? And the big question that's making headlines today: who actually owns it? Because here's the twist in the tale. While the panic these days is centered on China, right? That's all we're hearing about in the news cycle, with politicians warning about, spies disguised as soybean buyers or something. The data tells us a more nuanced story. Because as of 2020, countries like China, Cuba, Iran, Russia, the so-called adversaries of America, held just 1% of the roughly 40 million acres of foreign owned farmlands in the United States. 1%. That's what we're talking about here. And yet, in 2023, a Chinese surveillance balloon or spy balloon, whatever you want to call it, which I'm sure a lot of us have heard about, drifts over the Midwest. And suddenly there's this bipartisan panic that the Chinese are buying up every cornfield in Kansas. But when you look closely, it turns out the real big landowners are a lot closer to home, Patrick. And that is the Canadians.
We know them well. Okay. Yes, our friendly northern neighbors.
Yeah,
My father's Canadian. I've told you this
that's
many
right.
times. Hardly the menace some imagine, right?
Yeah.
Canada holds nearly a third of all foreign-owned U.S. farmland. Mostly the forest is in Maine and Michigan. Okay. After that, it's European countries, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, the UK. Basically, the foreign farmland market is dominated by NATO allies.
Yeah. And I think, for those watching live right now or
It's
watching
crazy.
on YouTube, you can see this chart. This is put out by the American Farm Bureau. I mean, it just shows you kind of it's interesting to look at how, the farmland is divvied up, the foreign farmland is divvied up between the different countries of the world. But there's more to this than just the national flags being stuck into the soil, right? What's really fueling this increase in foreign land ownership is long-term leasing, basically leases of 10 years or more. And much of it isn't actually for crops or cattle at all, Patrick, but for wind and solar development. Renewable energy, in other words, is reshaping the American rural economy. And they're doing this primarily because of carbon credits and, objectives that these different countries have to hit when it relates to climate. And that's really an important distinction, right? Because when people hear, foreigners are buying farmland, they often imagine ships of wheat sailing to Shanghai or secretive Chinese firms stockpiling pork or whatever other product. But in reality, almost half of the foreign held land is forest, like you just described with Canada. Then another quarter is pasture, and only 25% is actual cropland. And a good portion of that is leased to build turbines or solar farms. And these investments are fully legal because since 1978, the Agricultural Foreign Investment Disclosure Act has required all foreign entities to report U.S. land holdings to the USDA. Now, whether or not everybody's actually doing that is another another point. They're supposed to be doing it, and obviously there are enough people doing it, but I'm sure there's a lot of that aren't. But the point to be made here is there is no federal ban about foreign states owning land because you can based on that law. That said, as of 2023, after that spy balloon incident, there are, I think, up to date now 24 states that have some kind of restrictions in place. And one of those states is actually Arkansas. In 2023, they passed a law barring what they called prohibited foreign parties from acquiring agricultural land. And the spark again behind that, like I just mentioned, was that spy balloon. So the idea that lands near military bases, say Grand Forks Air Force Base in North Dakota, might be bought by a Chinese firm and somehow used for espionage, that is a trigger for a lot of these state prohibitions around foreign purchases.
And that's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, wow, right? Like, and as always, right, John? Like, I don't even know. Like, as we go, as we is, it's funny to say this. I want to bring up something because we're talking a lot about, different countries, right? And I love that you said that earlier that you were talking more about, like people think it's Chinese, right? That's what they think. They think it's all about the Chinese owning our land, and they think that ev- the Chinese, the spy balloon, right, John? Like,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
so much things that are out there that we see, and that's one of the topics I really want to bring up. Um, is it's in South Florida, like living in Florida. Um, One of the things that I've noticed is like dragon fruit groves.
Hmm.
I started to visit some dragon fruit groves in South Florida, and I started realizing the Asian, population that was farming these groves too. And that's where I started asking, that question, which was, I was like, wait, I was like, who owns the land here? And that's what was crazy is that and again, I don't have the actual facts on this, is realistically the Chinese population owns a lot of that farmland. And there was a bill that was put in the early 80s and 90s that allowed them um, to do this, right? And to purchase land. So, when I was down there, visiting, I was just like, oh my gosh. And so that was really interesting to me, that when you look at dragon fruit from Florida, like in the Homestead community, right? Right, John?
Hmm.
It's owned by the Chinese, but obviously they're American, Chinese American, right? They live here now, they farm, but the packing house was all Chinese.
Mm.
The laborers was all Chinese. So it was interesting, and I didn't know any of that. Now, going back to that, right? The espionage, right? That was the Fu Feng deal, wasn't it? Right?
Oh yeah, what I was talking about, yeah, about the Air
Yeah.
Force Base.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
But I had to
basically,
jump around and just at least tell people, like, there's things that the America put in place for immigrants to be successful, though, too, in the United States, right?
yeah,
So
and we're gonna talk about the labor side of this, but yeah,
going
I mean,
back to the Fu Feng deal,
yeah,
though.
yeah, that deal, which again is kind of feeding into that fear of military bases being exposed to these land purchases. This deal that happened where this Chinese company bought 370 acres near Grand Forks with the goal of building a corn mill, right? But that land, the problem was within 15 miles of the base. And that, of course, triggered this political firestorm. Senators called for the deal to be canceled. Mayor got hate mail. It all played out. And eventually the city just shut down the project. Even after that scandal, again, Chinese owned land in the US is just a drop in the bucket. As of 2021, Chinese investors held just 384,000 acres. That's less than a percent of all foreign held lands and just a fraction of a percent of total farmlands. And you compare that by contrast to American companies, they own over 9 million acres of farmland abroad. So again, just to give a little context.
Wow. I mean, that's it's amazing when you look at that. But John, if there's one deal that continues to haunt the headlines, it's the 2013 acquisition of Smithfield Foods
Mm.
by that's Shanghui, now the WH Group. That wasn't just about pigs; it was about pork dominance. Am I right?
Yeah, so I know this is not necessarily produce related, but it's pertinent to bring up because the Smithfield is the largest pork producer in the U.S. For those who don't know, I mean, I personally didn't know before reading up on it, but when this WH Group took it over, they gained not just the supply chain, but also 146,000 acres of farmland.
Wow.
Now, here's what's strange because a week before the deal closed, Missouri, which is where most of this land was based, lifted its ban on foreign agricultural land ownership, allowing foreign entities to own up to 1% of the state's farmland. And the timing, as critics pointed out, was interesting, to say the least. And it was, again, this classic case of vertical integration because WH Group now basically controls everything from piglets to processing plants, right? And even if China's share of US land is still small, this kind of control over the food supply makes people nervous. But here's the larger context: land, like oil, is finite. And in the US, we have roughly 10% of the world's arable land. That's why foreign investors are so interested, and not just foreigners, but Americans too, right? Because you have Bill Gates as an example, who's now the largest private farmland owner in the country. He has 270,000 acres in 18 states. And again, this is definitely going to be a topic that we're going to speak on a separate episode in the future. But it just reiterates again why people haven't been investing in America and its land, because we have so much of it. And the investment helps America in certain ways as well. And it's not just farmland that's feeling this effect, right? It's housing too, because financial firms like BlackRock and Blackstone are also buying up property, specifically residential property, driving up prices and pushing out first-time buyers. So land is a fixed asset, and investors are now betting on it like they once bet on tech stocks. I mean, land has always been an investable thing, but we've seen a pickup on recent history when it comes to U.S. land.
Yeah, and the origins of this story go way back, right? I mean, back to 1784 in the land ordinance. But John, real quick, I mean, we've got a couple. I got to read it from my phone because they put them on the comments, not during. I would say they put them on the comments, not the live stream comments. So I got to read them from my phone, and I want to share some of these comments because we want to make sure that everybody has a voice too. Let's see here. So if you look at, I got to get back to it now. We had someone write us and say, will we touch on foreign investors buying up these distributors and that we've seen in our industry? That's one too. But you did touch on that, right, John? That there's yes. If you look at the comments, who made that comment, but it's more or less, yes, that's happening more and more. They're buying distributors, they're buying packing plants, everything. I mean, listen, what about this one right here? My football team is always the San Diego Chargers. I call them San Diego Chargers because that's where I was born and raised. But even then, it was Qualcomm Stadium, and then guess what? It became Snapdragon Stadium. It was purchased by a Chinese company. Right now, obviously, they're the LA Chargers now. But yes, so to that question, is we are touching on it, and because we're seeing it more and more, and even in today, we're getting a lot of foreign investors that are going after the distributor, the food supply chain. Are they making it better? I'm not sure. We don't know yet, right? We really don't. So take us back though to that 1784 in the land ordinance, though, John, because and then I'll read another comment from another guest.
Yeah, so that ordinance, again, to give context of how the origins of how far this goes back, right? Because this ordinance let the federal government seize, basically take 1.5 billion acres of indigenous land. Because remember, there was other people here before the Europeans arrived, and so they took that land and then they sliced and sold it off in 1 mile square plots. And that patchwork map, all those square-looking states in the West that you see on the United States map, right? All those perfectly square-looking shapes. That's a result of this, and it became this economic skeleton of the United States. Then you fast forward to the Homestead Act of 1862, and there you have settlers being offered 160 acres if they just stayed 5 years. We obviously touched on that in the Llewellyn series that we're doing. And so it was this manifest destiny codified in real estate law. That ethos of land as opportunity still defines America. But now the buyers are wearing suits and they're carrying briefcases, not pitchforks and farming equipment, right? And meanwhile, the average age of American farmers is rising. The young people can't afford to buy the land because over 2,000 acres a day, Patrick, are being converted for developments. I mean, we see that all across the country. And the farmland map, as a result, is shrinking and being concentrated to fewer, wealthier hands. And yes, of course, some of them happen to be foreign hands. So the next time someone panics about Beijing buying up all the Iowa cornfields, it's important to remember the real story is less about espionage and is actually more about economics. It's more about global capital flows, renewable energy, speculation, and yes, in the case of Canada, a lot of timber. But let's pivot here a little bit, Patrick, because the other side to the points brought up by the U.S. Secretary in her press conference a few weeks ago is about labor, because here too the idea of 100% American farm workforce is frankly a bit of a fantasy for as we'll see and uncover here.
100%, and that was actually another comment as I'm looking down at my phone too. Is one of the comments that we got, which again, we want everybody to have their own voice and their opinion, right? So one of our viewers on LinkedIn, let me see what their name is. I'm calling them out. Anthony San Lucas, sales director for Asia Pacific. And he says, this is great. He says, Trump needs to fire Brooke Rollins along with Susie Wiles, Pam Bondi, Dan Bongino, and Kash Patel if he hopes to restore his trust from his MAGA base. They are all deep state Bushites beholden to the district of corruption, all the lobbyists and donor class. Why on earth is Rollins continuing Biden's lawfare on the private family-owned farms across the nation to include the Amish in Pennsylvania? Why? Well, because she is the pocket of big agriculture and is working to reverse all of RFK's Maha agenda. She belongs behind bars, along with the rest of the sellout rhinos. She was pushing for mass amnesty for the illegal, so big agriculture would have the cheap labor they are bribing her for. She made it about face only because Americans starting to wake up and understand her agenda. Listen, great comment though. I mean, it shows our industry. I mean, this is people in our industry, right? Ag that are really passionate about this. So I wanted to read that from Anthony as well, because obviously you could tell he's following this very, very deeply, right, John? So
I think what's important to take away in that comment is, look, there's a lot of sides to this. It's not a black and white matter as we're trying to paint as we're going through this now, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the land ownership, so you kind of have an idea of where that kind of originated and how it's evolved over the existence of this country. But then the second piece of that is labor, which we're going to talk about in a second. And again, it's so nuanced and it's so gray because there are truths or I guess there's pros and cons to the whole both sides of this thing. And as we walk through this a little further and when we get to the end and kind of share our thoughts a little more deeply, there is really no silver bullet, if you will, solution to some of the challenges around this. But let's talk about labor, Patrick, and what that has looked like.
Yeah, of course, right? And as always, it has been, John, right? American agriculture has always relied on someone else's hands. From the earliest colonial days, it was enslaved Africans who toiled in the fields, right?
Yeah.
We actually talked about this in an earlier episode on the transatlantic slave trade, remember?
Yeah.
So by the 18th century, plantation economies in the South were utterly dependent on forced labor. When slavery was finally abolished, the dependency didn't end, though. It simply just shifted, right? And in the 19th century, we saw the rise of immigrant labor, right, filling the vacuum. Chinese, Japanese, and Hispanic workers became the backbone of American agriculture, especially in the West and the Southwest, right? So let's go ahead and start with the Chinese. Many Chinese arrived during the California Gold Rush in the 1850s to seek their fortune, and others helped build the Central Pacific Railroad.
Mm-hmm.
But quite a few ended up in ag, not just as laborers, but as skilled farmers, right? So many Chinese immigrants were experienced farmers fleeing instability in China. Things like the Taiping Rebellion and the Punti Hakka clan wars. And in California at this time, there was a serious labor shortage as ag was expanding so rapidly. So what did these white landowners do? They hired thousands of Chinese migrants to fill the gap. And these experienced Chinese laborers would go on to make lasting contributions to California's fruit, vegetable, and wine industries. But they were met with brutal racism. Chinese workers were paid a fraction of white workers and what they earned, and they were treated as inferior. When economic crises hit in the 1870s, anti-Chinese sentiment boiled over into, I would say, a full-blown phobia, right? Xenophobia, and that culminated into what? The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. And if you're watching, we have that up there. So the first law to ban an entire national origin group from immigrating to the U.S. By the 1890s, Chinese laborers made up 3/4 of California's agricultural workforce. But after a wave of violent riots and racist propaganda, most were driven out. So who filled the gap next, John? I'll tell you who it wasn't. Unemployed white Europeans. They saw these jobs as unattractive, too difficult, and too low paying. So it came to, obviously, the Japanese.
Yeah, the Japanese are back. See, I told you we're going to come back to
Yeah.
them. So this is their story in the labor side of things. So it's the early 20th century. Migration from Japan is surging, largely driven by overpopulation and economic strain at home. Kind of a similar formula here. And so between 1901 and 1908, more than 127,000 Japanese immigrants arrived in the U.S. And Patrick, much like the Chinese before them, which you just described, they brought extraordinary agricultural expertise. Japanese immigrants took these worn out marginal lands and transformed them. And they did that through careful irrigation, advanced fertilization techniques, and just rigorous soil management. They were just very skilled in this area. And so by 1941, Japanese Americans were responsible for more than a third of California's truck crops. And their influence wasn't limited to the farm. They also played a crucial role in produce distribution as well. But their success, predictably, again, following a similar pattern here, ended up stirring resentment. Anti-Asian sentiment began to intensify again, feeding into that hysteria of the so-called yellow peril. And so again, the U.S. responded. And this time it starts with the 1907 Gentlemen's Agreement, which quietly limited Japanese immigration. And then came along the far more draconian Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively shut the door to Japanese immigrants. They were no longer allowed into the country. Then about 20 years after that, of course, what's on the international stage? World War II. And as a lot of listeners probably recall, Japanese Americans, many of them farmers, were forcibly interned in the United States. And as a result, they had their lands that they had cultivated were seized, crops were abandoned. And once again, the American agriculture machine found itself in urgent need of labor.
Oh, man, how dare them.
Yeah, so you have the Chinese out, you have the Japanese out. Who comes next?
Right. I was trying to find like a wah, wah, wah. But you're right. And now comes the Bracero program. So beginning in 1942 and running through to, I would say, 1964, the U.S. brought in over 4 million Mexican workers to fill the gap.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Officially, the program was temporary. In reality, it endured far more than 2 decades. Yeah. So no, it wasn't just to fill the gap right now, right? It was much longer. And it was riddled with problems. Who got to become a bracero often had less to do with farming skill and more to do with political favors, payoffs, and corruption. So Mexican officials played gatekeeper, and the selection process was anything but transparent, John. Still, the bracero program reshaped the labor force in American ag. It provided manpower, but it also created incentives for undocumented immigration. Many employers, just desperate for cheap, flexible labor, were more than willing to bypass red tape. Mexico, for its part, I would say, pressed the U.S. to crack down on employers hiring undocumented workers, but those demands were never codified into law. However, with growing opposition from labor unions like Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers and civil rights activists, the program finally came to an end in 1964. So, John, the question now is, who did the government turn to next in a move that seems almost, I would say, comedic in hindsight? American teenagers?
Yeah, that's right. The A
What?
team. The A
Oh, the
team.
A team. All right.
Well, maybe not the A team you're thinking about. This is just this.
Oh,
The A team
oh.
is an acronym for athletes in temporary employment as agricultural manpower. That's the A team I'm talking about. And so basically in 1965, with the Bracero program now out the door, the federal government ends up recruiting, believe it or not, 18,000 17-year-olds to pick crops in California and Texas.
Well, I'm gonna tell you this. Different time, am I right? Because I'm gonna tell you right now, you couldn't find 18,000 Gen Z or Alpha generation to go pick crops in California or Texas.
No, I don't
You
think
can't
so.
even convince me to do it. I mean, I would do it if I had to, right? Because I think we're from that generation. But
Perhaps.
um, they wouldn't. But let me ask the question:
Mhm.
how'd that go?
Well, obviously, we don't still have 17-year-old students still working it, so not very well. That's to put it modestly, right? And it's actually a great case study for what the current administration is kind of hinting at.
Yeah,
Able-bodied Americans. What is more able-bodied than 17-year-old athletic kids, right?
that sounds
Well,
great, right?
what happened? So to your point, Patrick, fewer than 3,500 even made it to the fields out of that 18,000, right?
They
Eight.
didn't even show up.
So
They,
like
didn't-
over 17,000 looked at it and said, "Nah, I'm good.
they were like,
I'm not going there."
no. Like,
So of the 3,500 that kind of, I guess, went in there, most quit almost immediately. They protested against the sweltering conditions, the terrible housing, the
oh
backbreaking labor.
gosh.
And unsurprisingly, the program just was scrapped just after one summer. It was done, which led inevitably back to undocumented labor.
Of course.
And so by 1986, the US tries a different approach. And that is the thing that we all hear about today, which is the H-2A visa program. And that was designed to provide temporary legal farm workers, you know, a passage into the US, but it was part of this broader Immigration Reform and Control Act. But the H-2A system is notoriously clunky. And anyone who works within the produce industry knows this, right? It's underused, it's slow, it's mired in bureaucracy. And so, as it stands today, somewhere between 50 to 70% of US farm workers are immigrants, and many of them are undocumented. And the reality is, the wages and the working conditions are so poor that most American citizens won't take those jobs, right? And again, we've seen this through the time that we've been talking over the last hour, Patrick. Every time there's been an opening for Americans to get involved, they say no, no, not doing that. You can't pay me to do that. It's not good enough pay. It's too hard work. So when politicians say we need 100% American farm workforce, they're not just ignoring history, right? They're ignoring reality of what the people are willing to do.
Yeah, it's striking. I would say how every few years,
Yeah.
especially is in elections, season, this fear resurfaces. It really does, that American farmland is being stolen by foreign powers, and that the only solution to take it back often calls for 100% American workforce. And it's a potent image. The land is sacred, food is life, and suddenly you've got a populist campaign ad practically writing itself, right, John?
Yeah. I mean, that part makes sense, right? But when we put on our historian hat, as we do on this show, Patrick, we have to ask, why? Why does this keep coming back? Because this isn't a new anxiety. It's as old as the republic itself, as we've been laying out, right? Land, labor, national identity have always been deeply, deeply intertwined in the American imagination. So what we're seeing today is a familiar cocktail. It's nationalism, food security, and good old fashioned election year populism, right? And it's not just rhetoric, it's policy. We mentioned the alien land laws. On paper, they were about keeping farmlands in American hands. In reality, they were tools of xenophobia aimed squarely at Japanese immigrants succeeding in in California's agricultural sector. The law barred, quote, aliens ineligible for citizenship from owning land. And that was coded language because Asian immigrants at the time were legally barred from naturalization. So this wasn't about protecting the soil. It was about preserving white economic dominance. And similar laws popped up across the Western states at that time. Now, fast forward to today, and the language has barely changed. I mean, politicians warning about Chinese ownership of farmland, suggesting espionage or sabotage. You know, it's not to say that's not impossible, but the numbers tell a different story. Because as we covered earlier, Chinese firms own under 1% of foreign owned US farmland. The real top buyers are, American allies generally, Canada, the Netherlands, the UK. So why the panic? Because it taps into deeper fears, right? Of that dependency, of invasion, not with guns and things like that, but with dollars and labor visas. But here's the historical irony. America's farms have always depended on foreign capital and foreign labor, right?
Of course. I mean, and American agriculture was built on imported labor. Let's be real, right?
Yep.
And today it's no different. Seasonal labor, especially in fruit and vegetable production, comes overwhelmingly from abroad. Farms don't just want these workers, they need them. Okay. There aren't enough Americans lining up to harvest strawberries in 100-degree heat for $10 an hour.
No.
And there's capital, right? Foreign investment often plays a key role in keeping agriculture viable, especially in a world where modern farming requires massive upfront infrastructure costs, cold storage, irrigation, machinery, and even global distribution networks. So if you want to compete in exports, grains, almonds, wine, you need a serious capital. And who has that kind of capital? Well, very rarely the mom and pop businesses or the small farmer do, right?
Yeah.
It's the foreign investors, private equity firms, and multinational businesses.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's deeper than we think.
Yeah, and this again, I think it's important to reiterate. This isn't a new phenomenon. And I think that's the point, or the the thing to carry away from this episode as we painted the history here. This isn't a new phenomenon. What we're seeing now is just the 21st century version of a centuries old story, and it's
Yep.
not just in America. Honestly, it's happening everywhere and for different reasons. You look at the United Arab Emirates, right? UAE. It's a desert nation, rich in oil, of course, but very poor in farmland. So what do? They buy land in Sudan, where water is more plentiful, to secure their own food supply. So their focus is obviously more climate related. They physically can't grow food, so they have to buy land somewhere else. Or China, which has invested in farmland across Africa, a lot more in Africa than in the US, even though they have it obviously in the US, but a very small percentage. So while the rhetoric talks about sovereignty and taking back our farms, the reality is, again, far more complex. The US food system is deeply, deeply enmeshed in global networks of labor and finance. And cutting that all off in the name of nationalism might sound good in a stump speech, but historically, it just doesn't hold up. And what's more, it risks repeating the mistakes of the past, right? Scapegoating immigrants and outsiders rather than facing the structural issues within American agriculture itself. So maybe the real question isn't how do we make agriculture more American? Maybe it's how do we manage sovereignty in a global agricultural system? Food security today isn't about drawing lines on a map. It's about infrastructure, cooperation, and a cross-border labor force. And that may be the greatest historical lesson of all, right? Agriculture has never been purely national. And we've seen this time and again here on the history of fresh produce, from the grain routes of ancient Mesopotamia and the Silk Roads across Asia to, the air freighted blueberries in your fridge today. Food produce has always crossed borders, and trying to resist that has often spelled disaster for those populations. Um, so that's kind of our historical perspective on what's happening in today's political environment. Because when we saw that, we said, wow, this would actually make for a great kind of deep dive into, what's the story behind some of these claims about American farmland being stolen, or the workforce problem and all these things. And so hopefully there's a little more insight that we can provide. Again, none of this is a straight answers here or straight solutions, but I think it's important understanding the historical context on these things, knowing where we came from, the lessons we can learn from those things, and how hopefully we can choose, a better path forward and not repeat some of those mistakes. So
I agree. I think it's a good background. We had some good comments that will go off. And it's weird. Some of them are coming through and some of them aren't. But Amy Boldu said, I'm deep in this situation, wanted to buy farmland to grow food so it's not developed, but land is
yeah,
just so crazy expensive, right?
yeah, that's the whole problem, right? With a lot of this being consolidated into fewer hands, and a lot of those fewer hands are very wealthy people, so they kind of control it. And then on top of it, you have less supply, and developers are willing to spend big bucks versus a small farmer who doesn't necessarily have that capital. And
Who doesn't have it,
yeah,
right? So John Pandel had some good comments in as well, which I want to show some of his. John, shout out to John Pandel, Pandel Brothers. So during World War II, one Delano grower would get a bus, load up drunks on Skid Row in LA, and use them for labor.
yeah.
And John, I believe you. What one Delano grower was that, John? Can you tell us, John? Write that. Let us know.
That shows you again how desperate American farmers have always been for labor, because there's always been a shortage.
When the braceros would go home for the season, JCPenney in Fresno would open after hours, 7 to 9, and the buses would bring the braceros. They would lead up on staff before they went back.
Yeah.
John's got some good history here. John said, Angelo apple growers in the Paro Valley, which is Watsonville, California, complained about the Croatians. First, they came to pick, then to buy the crop, then to lease the orchard, then to buy the land anymore. And they might as well call it Little Dalmatia, right?
Well, it's funny that at that point,
though, too,
but
right?
that point is a perfect example. Again, we talked just about the Chinese and the Japanese laborers and then the braceros, but obviously you had other people, like I guess in this case the Croatians, who I even know about. But again, that was the fear, right? That these people would become so successful as they did, the Japanese, the Chinese, and they did, and that scared the American landowners, because they said, well, we don't want these other people taking our economic successes and making it their own. We want it for ourselves. And that's how a lot of these people got kicked out.
Yeah. And I just want to make sure, that was paraphrased from Jack London, 1911, that John put in there. Just so you know. And then John answered the question of who? Ready? Through the back channel.
Through the back channel.
The world. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? The world may never know. How did they get it? How did the drunks? Who were the
Exactly.
world? Another comment we had was Delano had Filipino farm labor camps. It provided a labor force, a farmland agriculture. Now, I know we mentioned the Chinese, but Fresno has a big Hmong population as well. So that was another big one. I had a lot of friends up in the Fresno area. My wife did as well, that were Hmong, that, they were in farm labor as well. And even to this day, right, we have the H-2A program that brings in the laborers. But it's interesting because, I've had many people reach out to me on this subject because there's so many foreign investors that are coming in. I mean, there's investors buying packing houses. There's investors doing a lot of this. But, one thing we got to understand, everyone, is that, yes, we are a land of immigrants, right, John? Right?
Yep.
Your family, my family.
First generation, yeah.
Same, right? I'm first generation. My kids are second generation. And we want to dog on that, right? Like, we forget where we came from, right? But we got to understand that. But I also got to jump back to that because the American farmer, we have to do what's right as well. And we can't be all things to all people, right? But if you want to see things change, you have to get up and invest, right? Mm-hmm. Americans are so easily to invest in, I would say, certain things. I'm not going to speak for everybody, but we know, John, right? There's a lot of things that Americans will invest in. But yeah, you're right. When it comes to, certain other things, they ignore it, right? And again, I'm going to tell you a quick story, which is I was 15 years old and as I eat my banana, my dad said to me, what do you want to do this summer? Because you're not sitting at home doing nothing. And I said, I got a job. I worked at like Winn-Dixie, 3 days a week. Only allowed to work a couple, less than 12 hours. And he said, well, you're going to go pick oranges then. Dad's in citrus. I said, okay. Right. I learned the first day what I do not want to do in my life.
Like all the other 18,000 California teenagers, the 18.
I've never seen, like, if you don't know what a banana spider looks like, that thing will scare you. Okay. It was hot. It was humid. I could barely get a bin full, right? And, back then we were paid by the hour. And I think it was like $12 an hour, back in the what was that, 2000 days. And that's what we got paid. And it was grueling. And I'd rather go construction. I'd rather go build houses, right? Because it was better that way. Why? It was grueling, man. And as my career developed within the fresh produce industry, I worked in the fields. I worked in the packing house. It was fun, right? But I started to realize what jobs I didn't want to do. It hadn't, and it did. It had to do with my body. It had to do with like, what do I want? Do I want to do this every day, day in and day out? But I got that aspect of it, and I was like, I still want to be in produce. And I'm glad that I was able to pick, John. I'm glad I was able to be,
perspective,
shipping, and I got my forklift driver's license and, a lot of that stuff. But it just came to a point where I was like, this is not what I want to do. And these people, right, the immigrants that we bring in, they were so much better than me. Okay. They were.
Well, look, I mean, there's a reason why, again, labor on the farms since the founding of this country has never been attractive to the, we'll call them for what they are, white European population. It started with enslaved labor, enslaved people from Africa, and it ends today currently with undocumented immigrants. And not because, they're saying we want to come here per se. It's because the farms, they need labor. And if people are not going to willingly work there, and you have a group of people that aren't from this country, that are, those dots are going to connect one way or the other. And so that's what we see. And so it's this issue of immigration, this history of undocumented immigrant problem really originates here in the agricultural sector in the history of this country, and that struggle to find that labor and how to do it in a proper way where the landowners don't feel threatened by those workers, and then the costs associated with it. So again, there's so many variables, but that's where a lot of this is born out of. And that's why I think it's so interesting to understand that story and the context of what we're dealing with. And it's not a black and white thing.
No, it's not. And again, we see it more and more every day. Right. We're seeing more farmland being purchased by, I would say, foreign organizations, foreign people. There's less Americans that are putting their money into farmland. Heck, I had a friend that I interviewed on the show in 2021, and she and her husband quit her jobs and to do farmland, and these hurricanes just wiped him out. I mean, it wiped him out to the point where they had to sell their farms and go back to jobs, and that's fine, right? But I mean, that's what's happening. I mean, again, John, do you have $4 million today to go invest in farmland?
Definitely not.
No.
Definitely
and so,
well, that's another thing, though. I mean, like we also said, that the amount of farmland, globally speaking, is shrinking because of climate shifts and all these things. So a lot of these foreign foreign individuals or foreign states aren't coming to the U.S. with the primary focus of buying land to spy or to create trouble. Again, I'm not saying that is not impossible, but for a lot of them, it's about securing their own access to food and to whatever other things that rely on soil and earth. Because again, it is changing, and this is why you do see more foreign investment. Again, it's not just in the United States; it's in other countries as well, especially in Africa. You see a lot of lands being purchased there by foreign investments as well. So it's a very deep history. I know we've talked for a very long time. Hopefully, again, everyone found this to be insightful. We will definitely have a lot more, standalone episodes on these unique stories, whether it be the Japanese experience, labor workers, or the Chinese, Bill Gates. I think that's also a fascinating topic that we'll talk about, and paralleling that with landowners from the Middle Ages and things like this. So a lot of interesting stories to uncover there as it relates to the environment today and how we see the world.
Yeah.
So anyway, As always, we appreciate all of you for listening in, for your support. If you are not a member of the History of Fresh Produce Club, uh, sign up. There are 3 different levels. You can pick what fits best for you. But for all those levels, you do get bonus episodes. And Patrick, we just put out a bonus episode this week from when we were in New York. So that was a fun episode, which again is only accessible to our club members. And there's a whole laundry list of benefits that you can realize being
Yeah,
a
for
club
sure.
member.
Join the club today. A couple ending comments I see in the chat from John Pandel. This is interesting too. The last farm credit customer dinner in Bakersfield, 3 groups of farmers: the old line Okies, Italians, and the Slavs. The first generation Mexicans and South Asian immigrants. So Mexicans in the cowboy hats and the sheiks in their turbans, right?
Yeah.
And then he also says before the scale that mechanical tillage permitted, subsistence farmers, right? I rode the bus to school with a family, 10 kids in a little house, and they had 20 acres of grapes. They did all of the work themselves. And when we went from mules to tractors, right, it changed. So it's, and I say that, horses to horsepower scale changed the game, right?
Yeah.
So it is. And what's interesting too is, on another note, like if you look at farming too, or even cattle or horses, I have my daughter's into equestrian and horses, and there are some of the equestrian ranches, the horse ranches, that some of their kids are homeschooled so they can tend to the ranch.
Yeah.
Seriously. So those are things that we have to think about today. It is very difficult to run farmland. And if you do own the farmland, it's a lot of upkeep too.
Yeah. It's a lot of work. Well, on that note, we're going to let people go because we could obviously keep talking forever, and we're not going to do that. So we'll let you be. Do tune in to next week's episode. We'll be dropping part 3 of the Llewellyn series. So until then, it's goodbye for me, John Papp.
And goodbye for me, Patrick Kelly.